The morning of June 19th, 1944, off the coast of the Mariana Islands, Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa stood on the bridge of the carrier Taiho and watched his strike aircraft disappear into the western sky. He commanded 9 aircraft carriers, 5 battleships, and 43 other warships. This was the mobile fleet, the concentrated striking power of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Ozawa had been a naval aviator since 1920. He understood carrier warfare. He had studied American tactics. He knew what his pilots faced. But something troubled him as he studied the horizon through his binoculars. American radar had detected his force hours earlier. His aircraft were flying into prepared defenses, and somewhere beyond that horizon was a concentration of American carriers larger than anything he had anticipated. The intelligence reports had been unclear about exact numbers. Some said 7 carriers. Others suggested 9. The truth was worse: 15 Essex-Class fleet carriers operated in the waters off Saipan that morning, supported by light carriers, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. Ozawa was about to collide with an industrial force that Japan had never seriously planned to fight. The irony was profound. The Imperial Japanese Navy had spent 2 decades preparing for a decisive battleship engagement that would never come. They had built the Yamato and Musashi, the largest battleships ever constructed, mounting 18-inch guns that could hit targets 25 miles away. They had refined their doctrine, trained their crews, and invested their limited resources in weapons designed for a battle their enemy had no intention of fighting. Meanwhile, the Americans had built something different. Not bigger battleships to match the Yamato, not super dreadnoughts with larger guns and thicker armor. They had built carriers, lots of carriers. More carriers than Japan could have imagined possible. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Essex-Class carriers represented a fundamental shift in naval warfare that Japanese planners had failed to anticipate. Not because they didn't understand carrier aviation, they had pioneered it at Pearl Harbor, but because they couldn't conceive of the scale at which American industry could produce such complex warships. Between 1943 and 1945, American shipyards completed 24 Essex-Class carriers. These were not small escort carriers or converted merchant ships. These were full-size fleet carriers, each displacing 27,000 tons, carrying 90 to 100 aircraft, capable of sustained high-speed operations across the Pacific. Japan had built 3 large carriers during the same period. They had lost 4 at Midway in June 1942. They had lost 2 more at Philippine Sea, which was about to begin. The arithmetic was devastating. American production had achieved what Japanese strategists considered impossible industrial dominance so complete that numerical superiority became overwhelming force. Admiral Ozawa didn't know these exact numbers as he watched his aircraft depart that morning, but he sensed something had changed fundamentally in the naval balance. The Americans weren't behaving like a navy that feared battleship engagement. They were operating with a confidence that suggested they held advantages Ozawa didn't fully understand. His battleships, including the Yamato, which was part of his force, were positioned to engage American surface ships if the opportunity arose. That opportunity would never come. The Americans had no intention of bringing their battleships within range of Japanese guns. They would fight this battle entirely with carrier aircraft, exploiting advantages in numbers, pilot training, aircraft performance, and operational doctrine that Japan could no longer match. The battle that would unfold over the next 2 days would be called the Great Mariana's Turkey Shoot by American pilots. For Japan, it would be the decisive defeat that ended any possibility of carrier warfare parity with the United States. But the roots of this defeat reached back decades, to decisions made in conference rooms in Tokyo about what kind of navy Japan needed and what kind of war Japan would fight. The foundation of Japanese naval strategy rested on a single concept: Kantai Kessen, the decisive fleet engagement. This doctrine had dominated Japanese naval thinking since the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 and 1905, when Admiral Togo Heihachiro destroyed the Russian Baltic Fleet at Tsushima Strait. That victory, achieved through superior gunnery and tactical positioning, became the template for Japanese naval planning for the next 4 decades. The logic seemed sound. Japan could never match the industrial capacity of potential adversaries, like the United States or Great Britain. Therefore, Japan needed qualitative superiority, better ships, better training, better tactics that would allow a smaller fleet to defeat a larger one in a single climactic battle. This thinking led directly to the Yamato-class battleships. If decisive battle would be won by superior firepower, Japan would build ships with guns no enemy could match and armor no enemy could penetrate. Construction of Yamato began in November 1937 at the Kure Naval Arsenal. The ship was built in absolute secrecy. Workers signed oaths never to discuss what they were building. The construction dock was covered with rope curtains to prevent aerial observation. When Yamato was commissioned in December 1941, just days after Pearl Harbor, she represented the pinnacle of battleship design. She displaced 72,000 tons fully loaded. Her main battery consisted of 9 18-inch guns, the largest naval rifles ever mounted on a warship. Each gun could fire a 3,200-pound armor-piercing shell over 25 miles. Her armor belt was 16 inches thick, backed by additional layers that brought total protection to over 20 inches in critical areas. The Yamato was designed to survive hits from 16-inch guns, the largest weapons the Americans were known to possess, while destroying enemy ships before they could close to effective range. Her sister ship, Musashi, was completed in August 1942. A third ship, Shinano, was laid down but would later be converted to a carrier. The investment was enormous. Yamato alone consumed resources equivalent to building several cruisers or a dozen destroyers. But Japanese naval planners considered this acceptable because they were building for the decisive battle that would determine control of the Pacific. Aircraft carriers fit into this doctrine as supporting elements. They would provide reconnaissance, protect the battle line from air, attack, and strike at enemy carriers to prevent interference with the main engagement. Japanese carriers had proven their effectiveness at Pearl Harbor and in the Indian Ocean raids of 1942, but they were not considered the primary striking force. That role belonged to the battleships. This thinking persisted even after Midway. The loss of 4 carriers in June 1942 was devastating, but Japanese planners interpreted it as a tactical defeat, not proof that battleships were obsolete. They began building new carriers and training new pilots, still viewing them as part of a combined fleet that would ultimately rely on battleship firepower in the decisive engagement. The Americans were building something completely different, and they were building it faster than Japan thought possible. The Essex-Class carrier program began not with grand strategy, but with pragmatic naval architecture. In 1938, the Navy's Bureau of Ships started design work on an improved Yorktown-class carrier that would correct deficiencies identified during fleet exercises. The designers wanted better aviation fuel storage, improved damage control, stronger anti-aircraft batteries, and increased aircraft capacity. They were not trying to revolutionize naval warfare. They were trying to build a better carrier based on lessons learned. The first ship, USS Essex, was laid down at Newport News Shipbuilding on April 28, 1941. The design called for a ship 872 feet long, with a flight deck 862 feet by 108 feet. The ship would displace 27,100 tons standard, reaching 36,000 tons fully loaded. Propulsion came from 8 Babcock and Wilcox boilers, driving 4 Westinghouse-geared turbines, generating 150,000 shaft horsepower. This gave the Essex-Class a top speed of 33 knots, fast enough to operate with the fleet, launch aircraft in almost any wind condition. The air group would consist of approximately 90 aircraft in the initial configuration, 36 fighters, 36 dive bombers, and 18 torpedo bombers. Later in the war, this would shift toward more fighters as the threat from Japanese aircraft increased and American fighters proved capable of ground attack missions. Protection came from a 4-inch armored belt at the waterline and 2.5-inch armored flight deck over the magazines and machinery spaces. This was not battleship armor. It was designed to resist bombs and shellfire from cruisers, not battleship main batteries. The Essex-Class was not meant to survive close-range engagement with heavy surface ships. It was meant to avoid such engagements entirely by striking from beyond the horizon with aircraft. Essex was commissioned on December 31, 1942. By that time, additional ships were already under construction. The Navy had ordered 9 more Essex-class carriers in 1940 and 1941. Congress appropriated funds for an additional 13 carriers in 1942 alone. American shipyards geared up for mass production on a scale previously attempted only with merchant ships. Newport News Shipbuilding, New York Naval Shipyard, Bethlehem Steel's Quincy Yard, Norfolk Naval Shipyard, Philadelphia Naval Shipyard, and Fall River Shipyard in Quincy, Massachusetts all received contracts. These were not small facilities. They were industrial complexes employing tens of thousands of workers, with massive building ways, heavy cranes, and the infrastructure to fabricate or assemble every component of a fleet carrier. The construction process was streamlined through standardization. Each Essex-class ship was built to the same basic design, with only minor variations between early and late vessels. Components could be prefabricated, subassemblies could be built in parallel, and construction techniques refined with each successive hull. Workers, many of them women who had entered heavy industry for the first time, welded hull plates, installed machinery, ran electrical cables, and fitted out the complex systems that made a carrier operational. The pace was remarkable. From keel laying to commissioning typically took 18 to 20 months, occasionally less. Newer yards improved with practice, finding efficiencies that shortened construction times. By 1944, American shipyards were completing Essex-class carriers at a rate of roughly 1 every 6 to 8 weeks. The Essex-class carrier was not merely larger than its Japanese counterparts. It represented a fundamentally different approach to naval aviation. The flight deck measured 862 feet by 108 feet, providing ample space for simultaneous launch and recovery operations. 2 hydraulic catapults could accelerate aircraft to flying, speed in less than 3 seconds. 4 wire-arresting cables, backed by hydraulic systems, could stop a landing aircraft within 200 feet. Below the flight deck, the hangar bay stretched 582 feet long, with overhead clearance of 17.5 feet. This was tall enough to accommodate any American carrier aircraft with wings folded. 2 centerline elevators and 1 deck-edge elevator moved aircraft between hangar and flight deck, capable of lifting 18,000 pounds at speeds approaching 1 foot per second. During combat operations, aircraft could be rearmed, refueled, and returned to the flight deck in carefully choreographed cycles that minimized downtime. The aviation gasoline system was a marvel of damage control engineering. 180,000 gallons of aviation fuel were stored in compartmentalized tanks deep in the hull, protected by cofferdams and surrounded by seawater-filled voids. Fuel lines ran through sealed trunks with remote-operated cutoff valves. If battle damage ruptured a fuel line, the affected section could be isolated instantly. Carbon dioxide flooding systems could suppress fires in fuel storage areas or hangar bays. Multiple redundant pumping stations ensured fuel could reach the flight deck even if some systems were damaged. Ammunition magazines held ordnance for the entire air group. 500-pound bombs, 1,000-pound bombs, 2,000-pound armor-piercing bombs for attacking battleships, torpedoes, depth charges, rockets, and millions of rounds of .50 caliber ammunition for the aircraft machine guns. All stored in temperature-controlled magazines below the waterline, served by electric hoists and handling rooms where ordnance crews could prepare weapons for specific missions. The defensive armament evolved throughout the war. Early Essex-class ships carried 12 5-inch 38 caliber dual-purpose guns in single mounts, capable of engaging surface targets, aircraft. These were backed by numerous 40mm Bofors guns in quad mounts and 20mm Oerlikon cannons in single or twin mounts. By 1944, some ships carried over 100 anti-aircraft guns. The firepower was sufficient to put up a wall of steel that made attacking the carrier suicidally dangerous for Japanese pilots. Radar gave American carriers capabilities Japanese ships could not match. The SK air search radar could detect aircraft formations at ranges exceeding 100 miles, providing early warning that allowed fighters to intercept approaching strikes while they were still far from the fleet. The SC surface search radar could locate ships at 40 miles in good conditions. The Mark IV fire control radar directed the 5-inch guns with accuracy that manual optical aiming could never achieve. But the most important advantage was operational. An Essex-Class carrier could sustain high-tempo flight operations for weeks without returning to port. The ship carried enough aviation fuel, ammunition, and spare parts to support hundreds of sorties. Underway replenishment from fleet oilers and ammunition ships allowed the carrier to remain at sea indefinitely. Japanese carriers, by contrast, typically returned to port after major operations to rearm and refuel, losing days or weeks of operational time. The American doctrine emphasized sustained pressure. Task groups built around 2 or 3 Essex-class carriers could maintain continuous combat air patrols, launch strikes throughout daylight hours, and recover aircraft at night if necessary. The Japanese approach relied on concentrated alpha strikes, launching every available aircraft at once for a single massive blow. This worked at Pearl Harbor when surprise was complete and opposition minimal. Against American radar and fighter direction, it meant exposing the entire air group to coordinated defense. American fighter tactics had evolved to exploit these advantages. The F-6F, Hellcat, introduced in 1943, was specifically designed to counter the Japanese Zero. It was heavier, faster in a dive, more rugged, and carried 6 50-caliber machine guns compared to the Zero's 2 20mm cannons and 2 rifle-caliber machine guns. The Hellcat could absorb battle damage that would destroy a Zero. It had self-sealing fuel tanks and armor plate protecting the pilot. American pilots trained to use their advantages, speed, diving attacks, and teamwork, rather than trying to turn fight with the more maneuverable Zero. By June 1944, the average American carrier pilot had over 300 hours of flight training before joining his squadron. Japanese pilots, their training programs devastated by losses and fuel shortages, often reached combat units with less than half that experience. Some had fewer than 100 hours total flight time. The qualitative gap in pilot skill compounded every other American advantage. Admiral Ozawa's strike aircraft departed their carriers beginning at 08:30 on June 19th. The first wave consisted of 69 aircraft, 45 fighters, 8 torpedo bombers, and 16 dive bombers. They flew eastward toward where Ozawa believed the American carriers were positioned. The Japanese pilots were confident. Many had combat experience. They flew in disciplined formations. Their mission was clear: locate and destroy the American carriers. At 09:57, American radar detected the incoming raid at 150 miles. Fighter direction officers aboard the carriers began vectoring interceptors toward the threat. Hellcats climbed to altitude, guided by radio calls from controllers watching the radar screens. Many bandits, bearing 265, distance 120 miles, Angels 24. The Hellcats turned west and accelerated. The interception occurred approximately 60 miles from the American carriers. 30 Hellcats from USS Essex and USS Yorktown hit the Japanese formation from above and ahead. The Japanese pilots found themselves engaged before they reached their targets, forced to fight through the interceptors while maintaining formation and protecting their vulnerable bombers. The combat was one-sided. American pilots used altitude advantage to dive through the Japanese formation, fire concentrated bursts, and zoom back to altitude before the Zeros could respond. The Hellcats' superior speed in a dive made them nearly untouchable. Their rugged construction allowed them to absorb hits that would have been fatal to Japanese aircraft. Of the 69 aircraft in that first wave, 42 were shot down. The survivors, scattered and disorganized, pressed on toward the American fleet. They encountered additional Hellcats, more anti-aircraft fire from the screening destroyers and cruisers, and finally the massed guns of the carriers themselves. Some Japanese pilots managed to release their weapons. One bomb hit the battleship South Dakota, causing minor damage. No carriers were touched. Only 27 aircraft from the first wave returned to their carriers. Ozawa launched additional strikes throughout the morning. Each met similar fates. The second raid of 128 aircraft was detected at radar range and intercepted 60 miles out. Hellcats destroyed 70 aircraft. The survivors encountered anti-aircraft fire so intense that pilots later reported it looked like a solid wall of tracers. 6 aircraft returned. The third raid of 47 aircraft was shredded by fighters. 7 returned. A fourth raid of 82 aircraft achieved nothing except adding to the loss totals. American pilots developed contempt for their opponents as the day progressed. The Japanese formations were predictable, the tactics unchanged since Midway. Japanese pilots seemed unable to adapt to American fighter tactics or coordinate effectively once their formations were broken. The skill gap was obvious in every engagement. American squadron commanders radioed their pilots, "Pick your targets carefully. There's enough for everyone." If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. By mid-afternoon, Ozawa had launched 373 carrier aircraft. 300 were destroyed. The American carriers had not been seriously threatened. Not one American carrier had been hit. The fighter direction officers and radar operators had orchestrated a defensive masterpiece, vectoring interceptors to meet each raid at maximum distance, managing the combat air patrol to ensure fresh fighters were always available, and maintaining a defensive umbrella that no Japanese attack could penetrate. But Ozawa's losses extended beyond aircraft. At 09:09 that morning, the submarine USS Albacore had fired a spread of 6 torpedoes at the carrier Taiho. 1 torpedo struck the carrier on the starboard side forward. The damage appeared manageable. Taiho maintained speed and continued flight operations, but the torpedo had ruptured aviation fuel tanks. Fumes began spreading through the ship's ventilation system. At 14:32, those fumes found an ignition source. The explosion ripped Taiho apart from the inside. She sank within minutes, taking down 1,600 men, including Admiral Ozawa's staff, though Ozawa himself was rescued. At 0400 hours on June 20th, Admiral Mark Mitcher, commanding the American Carrier Task Force, faced a decision. His scouts had not located the Japanese fleet during the previous day. Ozawa had withdrawn westward after the catastrophic losses, opening the range to over 300 miles. This was near the maximum range of American carrier aircraft. A strike launched in late afternoon would have to return after dark, a hazardous operation that would result in losses from crashes and pilots ditching in the ocean when they ran out of fuel. Mitcher decided to launch. At 16:10, 216 aircraft departed the American carriers. 95 fighters, 54 torpedo bombers, 51 dive bombers, and 16 torpedo-armed Avengers. They flew west into the late afternoon sun, searching for targets they knew were at the edge of their range. At 1840, they found the Japanese fleet. The American pilots attacked immediately. The Japanese carriers had limited combat air patrol. Overhead, most of their fighters had been destroyed the previous day. The ships maneuvered violently, throwing up anti-aircraft fire, but they lacked the coordinated fighter direction and radar coverage that had saved the American carriers. Dive bombers rolled into their attacks, releasing 1,000-pound bombs from 3,000 feet. Torpedo planes came in low, dropping their weapons at 500 yards range. The carrier Taiho took 2 torpedo hits and 1 bomb. She slowed, listing, fires spreading through her hangar bay. At 18:32, her magazines detonated. She sank rapidly. The carrier Zuikaku, veteran of Pearl Harbor and every major carrier battle of the Pacific War, took bomb hits that started fires but did not sink her. She would survive to fight another day, though barely. The carriers Junyo and Chiyoda took damage, but remained operational. 2 oilers were sunk. The American aircraft turned east as darkness fell. Many were critically low on fuel. Pilots calculated their remaining flight time and realized they would not reach the carriers. Some crews discussed whether to ditch near friendly ships or try to make it all the way. Radio discipline broke down as pilots called for navigation headings, fuel states, and emergency procedures. Admiral Mitchell made another decision. At 20:22 hours, he ordered every ship in the task force to turn on their lights, flight deck lights, searchlights, truck lights, every illumination the ships possessed. It was a tremendous risk the lights would reveal the fleet's position to any Japanese submarine within 50 miles. But Mitchell was willing to accept that risk to save his pilots. The pilots saw the lights from 40 miles away. They headed toward the glow like moths to flame. The carriers began recovering aircraft in conditions no one had trained for night landings, with exhausted pilots, damaged aircraft, and fuel gauges reading empty. Some pilots made perfect landings on their first try. Others crashed into barriers, missing wires, or misjudging altitude in the dark. Some landed on the wrong carriers. Some ditched in the water near the ships and were rescued by destroyers. Of the 216 aircraft launched, 143 returned. 20 were lost in combat, 80 were lost to crashes, ditchings, and fuel exhaustion. But most of the aircrew survived. Destroyers picked up pilots from the water throughout the night. By dawn on June 21st, 109 of the 109 aircrew lost during the mission had been recovered. The human cost was remarkably light given the operational risks. The Battle of the Philippine Sea was over. Japan had lost 3 carriers sunk and 2 damaged beyond immediate repair. More importantly, Japan had lost approximately 600 aircraft and most of their trained carrier pilots. The remaining Japanese carriers had virtually no air groups. They were floating hulls without the aircraft or pilots to make them effective weapons. The Americans had lost 123 aircraft, most to operational causes rather than combat. Not one ship had been sunk. Not one carrier had been seriously damaged. The numerical disparity in carriers had increased. The qualitative gap in pilot training had become unbridgeable. And the operational tempo that American industry supported continuous combat operations without returning to port made it impossible for Japan to recover or rebuild. Admiral Ozawa assembled his remaining forces after Philippine Sea and assessed what remained of Japanese carrier aviation. The numbers were devastating. Of the 473 carrier aircraft he had embarked on June 18th, fewer than 100 remained operational. The pilots lost represented years of training that Japan could no longer replace. The naval air training program had been gutted by fuel shortages, lack of replacement aircraft, and the need to commit partially trained pilots to combat operations before they were ready. The institutional knowledge accumulated since the 1920s, the techniques for carrier landings, the tactics for coordinated strikes, the procedures for navigation over open ocean had resided in the experienced pilots, now dead in the Philippine Sea or scattered across the Pacific in earlier battles. Junior pilots who survived had learned their trade in combat rather than in systematic training. They knew how to take, off and land on a carrier, but they lacked the advanced skills that made naval aviation effective: navigation by dead reckoning, formation flying in weather, coordinated attacks on maneuvering targets. The Japanese Naval Air Service attempted to rebuild. Training programs were established in the home islands, using whatever aircraft could be spared from combat operations. But the students received perhaps 60 to 80 hours of flight time before assignment to operational units, compared to the 300 hours American pilots accumulated. Fuel shortages meant much of their training occurred in classrooms rather than aircraft. Some pilots reached their carriers having never practiced a deck landing on an actual ship, only on painted outlines on land bases. The carriers themselves survived Philippine Sea, but had become essentially useless without air groups. Zuikaku, Junyo, and Chiyoda returned to Japan for repairs. New aircraft were assigned to them, but the pilots were barely qualified to fly the planes, let alone employ them effectively in combat. The carriers could sortie, could launch, and recover aircraft, but they could not fight the kind of coordinated air operations that had made Japanese carrier aviation formidable in 1941 and 1942. Meanwhile, the Essex-Class carriers continued operations without pause. Task Force 38, built around the Essex-Class ships, struck Japanese positions across the Philippines throughout July and August. They hit Formosa in September. They ranged into the South China Sea in October, attacking targets in Indochina and along the Chinese coast. The operational tempo was relentless. Carriers would spend 30 to 40 days at sea, conducting strikes daily, refueling from fleet oilers, rearming from ammunition ships, then continuing operations. Only battle damage or scheduled maintenance brought them back to port. Japanese forces, watching this from the receiving end, could not comprehend the logistics that supported such operations. American submarines had cut most of Japan's maritime supply lines. Japanese ships struggled to obtain fuel oil. Japanese air bases scrounged for aviation gasoline. Yet the Americans operated massive fleets continuously, supplied by an endless stream of tankers and cargo ships that somehow evaded submarine attack and arrived on schedule. The truth was that American submarine warfare had reversed the strategic situation completely. Japan, an island nation dependent on imports, was being strangled by submarines while American logistics ships operated with near impunity. The submarines targeted tankers carrying oil from the Dutch East Indies, freighters bringing raw materials from Southeast Asia, and any major warship foolish enough to leave port without heavy escort. By mid-1944, Japan's merchant fleet had been reduced to a fraction of its pre-war tonnage. What ships remained were increasingly confined to waters close to the home, islands where land-based air cover provided some protection. The Essex-Class carriers exploited this advantage ruthlessly. They struck at Japanese shipping, sinking tankers and freighters that Japan desperately needed. They destroyed aircraft on the ground at airfields across the Pacific. They provided air support for amphibious landings, suppressing coastal defenses and attacking Japanese reinforcements. And when the opportunity arose, they hunted for the remaining Japanese carriers, knowing that without those carriers, Japan had no hope of challenging American naval dominance. In October 1944, American forces invaded Leyte Island in the central Philippines. The Japanese High Command recognized this as a critical moment. If the Philippines fell, Japan would be cut off from oil supplies in the Dutch East Indies. The empire would be unable to fuel its remaining warships or support basic industrial production. Admiral Soimu Toyoda, commanding the combined fleet, ordered a desperate counterattack. The plan called for surface forces to break into Leyte Gulf and destroy the American invasion fleet. Japanese battleships and cruisers would approach from two directions, catching the Americans between them. The remaining carriers, now redesignated the Northern Force, would serve as decoys. They would approach from the north and draw away the American carriers, leaving the invasion fleet vulnerable to surface attack. It was a battleship plan. The decisive engagement Japanese doctrine had anticipated for decades would finally occur not as a meeting of battle lines exchanging gunfire at 20 miles, but as a night surface action where Japanese ships would use their superior optical equipment and torpedo tactics to destroy American transports and support vessels. The carriers were bait, nothing more. They had few aircraft and barely trained pilots. Their value lay in attracting American attention. Admiral William Halsey, commanding the American Third Fleet, took the bait. On October 24th, American scout planes discovered the Northern Force approaching from the northeast. Halsey read the composition: 4 carriers, 2 battleships converted to hybrid carrier battleships, 3 cruisers, and 8 destroyers. He knew the carriers represented the last operational flat-tops in the Japanese Navy. Destroying them would end Japanese carrier aviation permanently. Halsey detached Task Force 38, 8 Essex-Class carriers, 8 light carriers, 6 battleships, and dozens of cruisers and destroyers, and sent them north to engage. He left the invasion beaches covered by escort carriers, small converted merchant ships with limited aircraft capacity and minimal protection. It was a calculated risk. Halsey believed the Northern Force represented the primary threat. He was wrong. The Japanese surface forces approaching from the west were the real danger. On October 25th, American carrier aircraft from Task Force 38 located the Northern Force and attacked. The strikes began at 0800 hours. Wave after wave of Hellcats, Helldiver dive bombers, and Avenger torpedo planes hit the Japanese ships. The carrier, Cheetos, was sunk by the first strike. Zuikaku, the last survivor of the Pearl Harbor attack force, took multiple torpedo and bomb hits. She capsized and sank at 1414 hours. Zueho was sunk by the afternoon strikes. Chiyoda was left dead in the water, to be finished off by American cruisers after dark. The Japanese carriers had achieved their mission. They had drawn Halsey north. But the cost was total destruction of Japan's carrier force. Not one of the 4 carriers survived. The pilots who had been aboard them, the few dozen who remained from the once formidable air groups, were killed or scattered. Japanese carrier aviation ceased to exist as an effective fighting force on October 25, 1944. Meanwhile, the Japanese surface forces had nearly achieved disaster for the Americans. Admiral Takeo Kurita's battleships and cruisers broke through into Leyte Gulf and engaged the escort carriers guarding the invasion beaches. Only desperate heroism by American destroyer crews and the pilots from the escort carriers prevented catastrophe. Kurita, confused by reports, and believing he faced fleet carriers rather than escort carriers, withdrew before completing the destruction of the invasion fleet. It was the closest Japan came to a tactical victory in the Philippines campaign, but even a tactical victory would have changed nothing strategically. The Essex-Class carriers had destroyed the northern force. Additional American carriers were in the Pacific or in production. Japan had no carriers left, and no possibility of building more. The naval aviation that Japan had pioneered in the 1920s and perfected in the 1930s was gone. What remained was increasingly desperate improvisation, kamikaze attacks by poorly trained pilots in obsolete aircraft, attacks that traded Japanese lives for minimal American losses. The Battle of Leyte Gulf marked the end of the Imperial Japanese Navy as a fighting force. The battleship Musashi was sunk by carrier aircraft on October 24. The battleship Yamato would survive until April 1945, when she was sent on a one-way suicide mission to Okinawa and destroyed by massed airstrikes from Essex-Class carriers. The surface fleet Japan had built around decisive battleship engagement never fought that battle. Instead, Japanese warships died under bombs, and torpedoes delivered by American carrier aircraft, attacked by an industrial system that Japan had never prepared to fight. Between 1943 and 1945, Essex-Class carriers participated in every major operation in the Pacific theater. They covered the Gilbert Islands invasion in November 1943. They struck Truk Lagoon in February 1944, destroying Japanese ships and aircraft in what had been considered an impregnable fleet anchorage. They supported the Marianas invasion, the Philippines campaign, the Iwo Jima assault, and the Okinawa invasion. They raided the Japanese home islands repeatedly in the final months of the war, striking airfields, factories, and shipping. The specific claim that Essex-Class carriers sank 161 Japanese warships requires careful examination. Different sources count losses differently. Some include only combat ships, others count auxiliaries and transports. Some attribute sinks to specific carriers, others to task groups. The most rigorous accounting suggests Essex-Class aircraft were directly responsible for sinking or destroying approximately 80 to 100 Japanese warships, including carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and submarines. If auxiliary vessels, transports, and merchant ships with military cargoes are included, the total exceeds 100, 50, and may approach 200. But the numbers, while impressive, tell only part of the story. The strategic impact of the Essex-Class program went beyond simple ship counts. These carriers enabled the island-hopping campaign that bypassed and isolated Japanese strongpoints. They provided air superiority that allowed amphibious landings to succeed with manageable casualties. They hunted Japanese submarines and destroyed Japanese reconnaissance aircraft, creating an operational environment where American forces could move and fight without constant threat from unseen enemies. The industrial achievement was equally significant. 24 Essex-Class carriers were completed during the war. Another 8 were under construction when Japan surrendered. The United States built more fleet carriers between 1943 and 1945 than Japan built carriers of all types in its entire naval history. This was industrial warfare at a scale Japan had never seriously contemplated. American shipyards didn't just build the carriers, they maintained them, repaired battle damage, and upgraded systems based on combat experience. When the carrier Franklin was hit by Japanese bombs off the coast of Japan in March 1945, fires killed over 800 crew and the ship was nearly lost. Franklin limped back to New York, was repaired at the Brooklyn Navy Yard, and could have returned to combat if the war had continued. Japan had no comparable repair capability. Ships damaged at Philippine Sea or Leyte Gulf, if they survived at all, often sat in port for months, awaiting parts and materials that never arrived. The human dimension deserves recognition. Tens of thousands of sailors served aboard Essex-Class carriers during the war. They operated the catapults and arresting gear, maintained the aircraft, loaded ordnance, fought fires, repaired damage, and kept the ships running through months of continuous operations. Thousands of pilots flew from Essex-Class decks, conducting missions that ranged from routine patrol to desperate combat. Many never returned. Every carrier had a section of railing where memorial services were held for lost aircrew, reading names of men who had ditched at sea or been shot down over enemy territory. For Japanese military leaders who survived the war, the Essex-Class carriers represented the clearest evidence of their strategic miscalculation. They had prepared for a short war, decided by a climactic battle. They had invested in battleships designed to win that battle. They had assumed American industrial capacity, while large, could not be mobilized quickly enough to affect the war's outcome before Japanese forces established a defensive perimeter that would be too costly to breach. Every assumption proved wrong. The war was not short. The climactic battle never occurred in the form Japan anticipated. American industrial capacity not only mobilized but achieved production levels that seemed impossible. And the defensive perimeter, while established, was systematically reduced by amphibious assaults, supported by carrier aviation that Japan could not match. Admiral Ozawa, who survived the war, later told American interrogators that he had known after Philippine Sea that Japan could not win. The loss of trained pilots was irreplaceable. The loss of the carriers themselves was secondary. Ships could theoretically be built, though Japan lacked the resources. But the pilots, the men who knew how to employ carrier aviation effectively, were gone. What remained were barely trained replacements, flying obsolete aircraft from damaged ships against an enemy with overwhelming material superiority. The morning of June 19, 1944, when Ozawa watched his strike aircraft disappear into the western sky, marked the moment when Japanese carrier aviation encountered reality. The industrial force they faced was not something that could be defeated through superior tactics or fighting spirit. It was a system that produced carriers faster than Japan could sink them, trained pilots better than Japan could kill them, and sustained operations longer than Japan could endure them. The mathematics were unforgiving. The outcome was inevitable. And the cost, measured in ships sunk and lives lost and strategic options foreclosed, was total. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.